The Apollo program was the first human spaceflight program aimed at landing a man on the Moon and returning him safely to Earth. It was initiated by President John F. Kennedy in 1961 and ran from 1969 to 1972, with a total of 6 manned missions to the Moon. On July 20, 1969, American astronauts Neil Armstrong, 1930 to 2012, and Edwin, Buzz, Aldrin, 1930, became the first humans ever to land on the Moon. About 6.5 hours later, Armstrong became the first person to walk on the Moon. As he took his first step, Armstrong famously said, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." The Apollo 11 mission occurred 8 years after President John F. Kennedy, 1917 to 1963, announced a national goal of landing a man on the Moon by the end of the 1960s. Apollo 17, the final manned Moon mission, took place in 1972. At the time, the United States was still trailing the Soviet Union in space developments, and Cold War-era America welcomed Kennedy's bold proposal. In 1966, after 5 years of work by an international team of scientists and engineers, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, conducted the first unmanned Apollo mission, testing the structural integrity of the proposed launch vehicle and spacecraft combination. Then, on January 27, 1967, tragedy struck at Kennedy Space Center in Cape Canaveral, Florida, when a fire broke out during a manned launch pad test of the Apollo spacecraft and Saturn rocket. 3 astronauts were killed in the fire. Despite the setback, NASA and its thousands of employees forged ahead, and in October 1968, Apollo 7, the first manned Apollo mission, orbited Earth and successfully tested many of the sophisticated systems needed to conduct a Moon journey and landing. In December of the same year, Apollo 8 took 3 astronauts to the far side of the Moon and back, and in March 1969 Apollo 9 tested the lunar module for the first time while in Earth orbit. That May, the 3 astronauts of Apollo 10 took the first complete Apollo spacecraft around the Moon in a dry run for the scheduled July landing mission. Timeline of the 1969 Moon landing at 9:32 a.m. Eastern Daylight Saving Time on July 16, with the world watching. Apollo 11 took off from Kennedy Space Center with astronauts Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin and Michael Collins, 1930, aboard. Armstrong, a 38-year-old civilian research pilot, was the commander of the mission. After traveling 240,000 miles in 76 hours, Apollo 11 entered into a lunar orbit on July 19. The next day, at 1:46 p.m., the lunar module Eagle, manned by Armstrong and Aldrin, separated from the command module, where Collins remained. 2 hours later, the Eagle began its descent to the lunar surface, and at 4:17 p.m. the craft touched down on the southwestern edge of the Sea of Tranquility. Armstrong immediately radioed to Mission Control in Houston, Texas, a now famous message: "The Eagle has landed." At 10:39 p.m., 5 hours ahead of the original schedule, Armstrong opened the hatch of the lunar module. As he made his way down the module's ladder, a television camera attached to the craft recorded his progress and beamed the signal back to Earth, where hundreds of millions watched in great anticipation. At 10:56 p.m., as Armstrong stepped off the ladder and planted his foot on the Moon's powdery surface, he spoke his famous quote, which he later contended was slightly garbled by his microphone and meant to be, "That's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind." By 1:11 a.m. on July 21, both astronauts were back in the lunar module and the hatch was closed. The 2 men slept that night on the surface of the Moon, and at 1:54 p.m. the Eagle began its ascent back to the command module. Among the items left on the surface of the Moon was a plaque that read, "Here men from the planet Earth first set foot on the Moon, July 1969 AD. We came in peace for all mankind." At 5:35 p.m., Armstrong and Aldrin successfully docked and rejoined Collins, and at 12:56 a.m. on July 22 Apollo 11 began its journey home, safely splashing down in the Pacific Ocean at 12:50 p.m. on July 24.